Hi everyone, it's Kirstine from the Mustard Tree Trust. Hello everyone. Do you remember last time we were talking about St Oswald? He was a king who came back over to Northumbria, and he'd been in Iona where he had learnt from the monks all about Jesus and all about God and how he had put God first in his life, and he'd brought God with him from Iona over to Northumberland. Well, bringing God with him to Northumbria wasn't just enough. He decided that all the people here needed to know about God. So, after a false start, he ended up bringing St Aidan over from Iona to Northumbria. So St Aidan came over to Northumbria, and he, with Oswald, wanted to tell the stories of Jesus and to go around the county, or country as it was known then, and to just show people God's love. He came over to Northumbria, and because he didn't understand the Northumbrian accent, he had to have a translator who happened to be the king at the same time. So as the king, Oswald, and Aidan wandered around Northumbria and got to know the people and got to know all the problems, they started to talk to the people about lots of things, including God. After a little while, St Aidan came with Oswald to live at Bamborough, but he didn't really like living at Bamborough. He didn't like all the grandeur and the poshness of the palace. And so he asked if he could go over to the little island that's in the sea just across the way from Bamborough. Now we now know that as Lindisfarne or Holy Island, and it was Aidan who first went over there and set up a home. Now Aidan was a very practical man, as well as a very loving one. And so those three things he wanted to do. Ultimately, this was his plan of attack for Northumberland. There was no social media or TV at those times, so they would travel around talking to the locals, and Aidan would tell them about Jesus. The more he talked to people about Jesus, the more they wanted to learn more. And so Aidan decided to set up a church, and he set up a church on Lindisfarne. We think that we found the place where Aidan put the church, and if you go over to Holy Island today, you can see some of the foundations. People began to worship God in their villages, and that was great. But there was one or two people who wanted to do more, and so Aidan set up like a monastery-type church building on Lindisfarne, and people would come and live with him and maybe become a monk, or at least spend time in these little villages where they could grow their own food, they could go back and help all the people in their own villages, and they could learn more about God and spread God's word as they did it. So the first thing that Aidan wanted to do was spreading Christianity, and that's how he did it. Person to person, and being really practical too, and helping the people around him. The second thing that Aidan wanted to do was make people more healthy. Now, he realised lots of people had some sort of illness, and he knew that the monks, those in Iona and those in other places, had actually learnt lots of things about the natural world and how they could help you with diseases. For example, did you know that garlic can help with your immune system, helping you fight off coughs and colds? Did you know that sage, the herb sage, is often used for headaches? And there's things like mint and burdock, which has got a long tall plant with a sticky bit at the top. But the root of burdock and mint help you with stomach bugs. He also knew that if you fall over and hurt yourself, if you wash the wound carefully, it's not going to get infected and it'll cause you less problems. So Aidan did two things to help with this. He trained up some local caregivers, people who maybe had tried to do these sorts of things and maybe they knew a little bit about health, and he gave them all his tips as well. But if that wasn't enough, he also built a hospital one of the first hospitals in Northumbria. And he built this hospital for people who really couldn't cope anywhere else. And the main point of this hospital was that it was clean. And people who lived in housing that wasn't very clean often were able to come to the hospital. And of course, Aidan would go and speak to them. And all the nurses and the caregivers in the hospital would go and speak to them about Jesus. And so even if they didn't survive, they had the comfort of knowing Jesus and understanding the stories that Aidan and the other monks taught them. The other thing that Aidan wanted to do, as well as spread Christianity and help people live more healthy lives, was he wanted to educate people. Now, you might not like going to school every day, but if you lived in those days, around 600 AD, you would have had a chance. Most people couldn't read or write or do anything with numbers. And so that meant that they were likely to be swindled a bit by their bosses. Or maybe they would have to sign something or put a cross next to something, or, well, we don't really know what they had to do. But people didn't understand it, and often people were misused because of that. So Aidan built a school. He built it on Lindisfarne, and he helped people who were in the village there with him to learn just some of the basic things. And then, of course, if they wanted to, they could go back to their home villages and tell all the other people about the basics of maths, the basics of reading. Maybe they taught them how to sign their name. But the reading was really important because the Bible wasn't around in those days. And Aidan, and more importantly, another monk who came after him, Cuthbert, thought that God's word was the most important document they could have. And so we'll hear a little bit more when we talk about Cuthbert, but it was really important that they shared God's word, both orally, by telling people, but also to start to write it down. And so Cuthbert in particular thought that was important. Now there's lots of stories about Aidan, but there's two I'm going to tell you about. When he came over to Northumberland, he loved walking around talking to people. And after quite a long time, maybe it's about 7 to 10 years, King Oswald died in battle. And his brother, who had a very similar name, he was called King Oswy. So King Oswy really liked Aidan too. And one day he decided to give the bishop, the monk, Aidan, a horse. You can't go around walking around everywhere. I mean, just look at the state of your feet and you'll be absolutely shattered. Tell you what, I'll give you a horse. So Oswy gave Aidan this horse. Well, Aidan was riding out of Bamborough and realised that the people around him didn't act the same, because all of a sudden he was a very important person on a horse, rather than just a man walking alongside them on the road. After a little while that day, Aidan came across a man who was begging on the road. And this man wouldn't even look at Aidan because he thought he was somebody really important, and this man wasn't worthy enough to look at Aidan. And so he kind of looked at the ground and said, "Please, can you help me?" and held his hand up for some money. Now Aidan looked at the man and said, "Yes, I can help you." And he got off his horse and he says, "But you have to look at me." And the man sort of looked up, trying to be respectful, but Aidan had told him to look at him. He said, "Here you go, have my horse." Well, the man was astonished. "Have your horse? But this is a really posh, kingly horse. I mean, if he was going to have a horse, he'd have some old farm horse, not very sleek and good for pulling ploughs, but not this beautiful, beautiful horse." But Aidan said, "I don't need this horse, and you do. I think it might be better if you went and sold it." We don't know whether that's what the man did. But the man took the horse, and all of his problems were solved. Because if he sold the horse and the saddle and the reins and the bridle to somebody who wanted a posh horse, he would get loads of money, probably enough to see him and his family going for years. And we think that's probably what he did. But you see, Aidan realised that There's no point having a horse if people around you can't live, can't afford to eat. Well, when the king heard about that, he was furious. I gave you this posh horse, and you just gave it away. You didn't even sell it. And Aidan said, hold on a minute. Are you saying that a horse is more important than a family of men and women and children? Because God doesn't think so. And by giving away my horse, I've actually managed to save that whole family. Well, I think Oswald had to agree, because people are more important. One of the other stories about Aidan was he was on Lindisfarne, and there was a bit of a battle going wrong on the edges of Northumberland. And he saw fire and smoke from one of the burning villages. And it was one of the kings called Penda who was trying to attack Northumbria and take over its lands. When Aidan saw that Penda had actually set fire to some of the villages, he just prayed to God to rescue and save the people in those villages. And something strange happened, because the wind changed direction. And instead of the fire and the flames going up into the sky or away from the army, it suddenly came back in all the army's faces, and all the soldiers couldn't see anymore. Well, of course, they were panicked, and they just fled and ran away from that village. And the villagers were able to put out the fire, and the soldiers didn't come back. So that's the way that Aidan was really practical in his way, that he prayed and talked to God. We'll hear a little bit more of that other saint, Cuthbert, next time. But for now, I just want you to remember Aidan, who was very, very humble, who went around talking to people about God, who tried to help to heal people, not just their inside anxieties and grief by telling them about Jesus, but also their physical health. And he also wanted to help them to be educated so that they could have better business lives. They could understand how the bartering system worked. They could count how many chickens they were buying or whatever it was. And he did that one person at a time, helping one family at a time. And even when other people weren't very happy with him, like that king who wasn't happy about him giving away his horse, Aidan knew it was the right thing. He knew he needed to help people help themselves. And he did that by spreading God's word, and more importantly, by spreading God's love to all the people he met. I think that's a bit of a challenge for me today. Is that a challenge for you? How are we going to spread God's love to the people we meet today? Well, goodbye for now. And I think we'll think about Cuthbert next time. Bye.